reach down between my legs, ease the seat back. She's running, I'm lying, right behind it, real me now. Got the feeling, but I was hearing, busy robbing me, no stopping now.
I was raced off of Route 3, out past where the blacktop ends.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Day 2 of the 7th Annual Growth Energy Executive Leadership Conference. Once again, please welcome your host, Kim Kuhn.
On that roadside picking blackberries, that summer I turned a corner in my soul down there.
How are you guys doing? You get recovered from last night? Yes, some of you. Did you guys have fun? Yeah? Yes? Give it up once more to Novozymes for sponsoring that great event. I had an awesome time. I know I got to talk with some of you. So for me, it was very fun and obviously an entertaining evening with our three hosts, Chad Greenway, Austin Dillon, and Chris Scholes. I do want to take a moment, though, to announce the auction raisings. You guys contributed so much. I was so impressed with the numbers. I was told the live auction raised $682,000. Yep. The silent auction, $12,430 for a grand total of $694,930. So let's give that a round of applause. Outstanding commitment from you guys. So congratulations to both the live and the silent auction winners. For the silent auction winners, if you missed it, right out front on the monitors, all of the names of the silent auctions are on there. So be sure to check that out. See if you were the winner of your bids. And of course, you can stop by the conference registration desk to make your payment and claim your prize. For those of you who weren't auction winners but still want to contribute to Growth Energy's charitable efforts, you can do so. Just visit the reps at the hospitality desk and they'll be sure to give you information on how to do that. Now, congratulations to all the winners and thank you again for your support. You know, we heard last night about the cause, and so knowing that money is going to a great place should make you guys feel really good. Quick factoid, did you know the ethanol industry now supports nearly 400,000 jobs and in 2015 produced 14.75 billion gallons? That is a lot of fuel. So look at today, we've got a busy schedule ahead, so hopefully you guys got some rest after last night's soiree and are full of coffee to get you through all the exciting things we have planned for you today. We're going to kick it off with a presentation from ethanol historian Bill Kaverick. We have three great panels this morning discussing a variety of topics. We'll cover the Growth Energy effort to overcome all of the policy, regulatory, and legal hurdles put in your path. I know it's not going to stop you, but we will cover that. Then we'll hear from experts on what is being done to expand foreign markets for ethanol. And finally, we'll wrap up our last panel and cover what Growth Energy is doing in terms of reaching consumers regarding American-grown ethanol. So 3 great panels ahead. I hope you guys are excited. Following those panel discussions, we will have the opportunity to engage with our co-chairs. So it'll be your chance to ask Jeff and Tom those hard-hitting questions. You can offer suggestions and maybe even a little constructive criticism. I think those guys can handle it. So get excited for that. And then finally, we'll close our conference with our awards luncheon. We do want to honor those here that have gone above and beyond the call of duty to extend the mission of Growth Energy and the ethanol industry. With that, I would like to introduce our first speaker. He is Bill Kaverick, like I said, professor of communications at Radford University. He is an expert in the ethanol industry. He was co-author of The Forbidden Fuel, a 1982 history of the ethanol controversy, as well as Henry Ford, Charles Kettering, and the Fuel of the Future, and other books covering media and environmental history. Right now, he's currently working on a full history of the biofuels industry. So he's the perfect expert to kick off our discussion for the day. Bill, if I missed anything on your extensive resume, feel free to fill in. I know you have quite the resume. So without further ado, please welcome Bill Kaverick.
Take all the rope in Texas, find a tall oak tree, round up all of them bad boys.
All right. Hey, how's everybody doing? Good morning. How many of you guys bought a truckload of enzymes last night? I almost did. I am so grateful to be here, and I'm hoping, oh good, there's that. And so here's the slide thing. Okay, good. So grateful to be here. It's so good to see you guys today. And I'm thankful to be hearing some of the stories here from people who are making the biofuels industry work today. It's a fascinating group of people. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with me. And I hope I can return the favor just a little bit by telling you about the history of your own industry. It's not a very well-known history, but it's a terrific story. It really is. It's full of espionage and heroic people caught up in difficult circumstances, people who stood up to the most powerful industry on earth and won. It's a story with a good many villains, too. People in the oil industry who tried to hurt the U.S. chemical industry and help the Nazis just before World War II broke out. That's an interesting story that has not come out well enough yet. Most people know a little bit about the story. They know that Henry Ford thought that ethanol was a pretty good idea and made sure that cars could run on farm fuels. But even if you don't know all the details of the story, when you hear the outline of it, you never forget it. It's really interesting. I first heard it from farmers who came to Washington, D.C. during the farm strikes of the 1970s. They told me there was a clean fuel additive that could replace lead in gasoline, that would decrease smog, that would increase national security, and would also help farmers. And I thought, what is this magic fuel additive? They said, well, you're drinking it now. And I thought, that can't be right. But it was. It's true. So that was the 1970s. And in the early 80s, I wrote a book with two friends called The Forbidden Fuel. And in the 1990s in graduate school, I worked on the history of ethyl-leaded gasoline. And right now I'm working on another book. And some of that book outline, I brought some posters along just to show you guys. So if somebody would hold up one of those posters. There's some more for free in the back. They're going fast. I brought about 40 of them. But on my website, you can download a PDF and have them printed out. It doesn't cost that much. They're tabloid size. So. And that would be fine. I want to share that stuff because this is my main message to you today, that if there's any of this history is helpful, if there's anything that I've found that helps put things in perspective for you or for your ethanol plant or for your farmers co-op, I want you to find my papers, to use my research, pick up some of the public domain images that are on the website, use those. Write me, give me an email, give me a call. I'll be glad to help. I want this history to be useful to you. And as a corollary to that, I'd like to see the ethanol industry find ways to encourage young historians, because we need younger historians to be working on this. There's still a lot of interesting issues. So in your communities, maybe FFA or some other kinds of groups, if the younger historians could work on the history of the fuel of the future, I think it would be a profoundly interesting thing, and I would be very grateful too. And if I can help with that in any way, just let me know. So let's think about how the history of ethanol is part of a larger history of renewable energy as well. And there's a poster over there that's kind of an outline for an exhibit, a museum-quality exhibit on the history of renewable energy. And that's where I think this goes in. So what's with the story with ethanol? What is this story? So one of the first things historians do is we try to categorize the sequence of events. So if we look at the history of renewable fuels, there's basically 5 time frames. There's a time when ethanol is a lamp fuel. There's the early auto fuels. There's this economic warfare period with leaded gasoline and Standard Oil blocking synthetic rubber, and you'll see why that's significant in a minute. And then most of us have lived through these last two historical epochs, the energy crisis, of course, and now in the 21st century, a well-established industry that's making a huge contribution. So early on, lamp fuels, and this is before kerosene, lamp fuels consisted of a variety of alternatives like whale oil, which was very expensive, and burning fluid, camphene, and that's the alcohol fuel. And it was the best bargain, and it was the brightest fuel. This lamp store is 1853, before petroleum, 1853 in Boston. Petroleum, you remember, was discovered in 1859. So there was already an established market that was in place long before the oil industry came up to push back the darkness and illuminate the light, as they say in their historical propaganda. This was a early splash blending plant in Boston. The Civil War came along, and there was a tax imposed on beverage alcohol, $2.08 a gallon, but they did not exempt industrial alcohol, which was a problem. In Europe, they did exempt industrial alcohol, and the Germans, especially, and the French, worked very hard. At one point, there were 95,000 alcohol-fueled stoves. There were about 75,000 distilleries, but most of them were small-scale, farm-scale distilleries. This is before World War I. Okay? Most of them were small-scale distilleries, and they were in the place kind of where electricity, the same niche that electricity came to occupy later. So you notice there's a water heater here, and there's a chafing dish right here. We actually had dinner last night was kept warm with alcohol fuel. Those chafing dishes really are alcohol. I guess you guys know that. Right? So a lot going on there. So one of the big expositions of this material, this is, of course, a German poster, but 1902, Agricultural Society, alcohol-fueled tractors and engines and prizes. You know, this was really an important part of the German farm economy. So when people say, you know, Henry Ford, he was really into alcohol fuel, and the question is why? Well, he was inspired, like a lot of American farmers were at the turn of the last century, in the early 1900s. He was inspired by this idea that the Germans were trying to work a new value-added product into their farming system. But it wasn't just the Germans, it was the French too. In 1902, there was the Congress of Alcohol Fuels in Paris, and I've always been struck by this particular image. It's really the muse of agriculture, Polyhymnia, and she's driving an early automobile. But it's a striking image because it corresponds with one of the main underlying themes of the early ethanol industry, which involves a reconciliation of man and nature, of urban and rural interests, and also, as one historian put it, the machine in the garden. So that was one of the early ideals of the early alcohol fuel industry. Very beautifully, graphically depicted. I picked this image up at the National Agricultural Library in Beltsville, Maryland. And I was pretty much taken with this. I thought, oh, this explains a lot. This is great. So now, let's see. There we go. By 1906, American farmers had managed to get the tax on alcohol fuels repealed. Teddy Roosevelt helped a lot. In fact, Teddy Roosevelt, who was against the oil trusts, made that statement in the Washington Post May 5th. It's really, Standard Oil has crushed out the competition. We need something to compete with them. And that was very wise. Okay, so after the tax was repealed, there was a surge of interest in the U.S. This is an ad from the National Grange. You can see that an alcohol lamp keeps watch at night with mom. So God, motherhood, apple pie, and the flag, that's the ethanol industry. And it always has been from early on. So the second part of our story involves auto fuels. And you probably know that the world's first internal combustion engine, by the way, this was going to be on the quiz today, and somebody said, no, don't get my quiz this early in the morning. Right? But you in the back there, you got to pay attention, because this is going to be on the quiz later. college professor talking here. But the world's first internal combustion engine, 1826, surprisingly early date, but it's true. Samuel Morey. This internal combustion engine is at the bottom of Lake Morey in Vermont today. Probably needs to be dredged up and made part of, let's say, a museum exhibit or something like that. That would be a good idea. And we all know that Henry Ford was early on a proponent of alcohol fuels. The way that you can tell that the early cars were designed for alcohol fuels is they have adjustable carburetor jets. They also have, a lot of them, adjustable spark ignition settings. So you can retard the spark just a little bit so the engine works better. Too bad they didn't have adjustable, compression ratios, right? Because that would have helped a lot. But there's, Ford started the first alcohol fuel research program in 1916 as well. So one way that an investor could attract investment in an auto company at the turn of the 20th century was to have his cars participate in a race. And this is how Henry Ford and many others got their start. In the US and Europe, there was a lively debate over ethanol versus gasoline for high compression engines. Early on, they figured out that they could add co-solvents and use ethanol as an octane booster. Anhydrous ethanol really wasn't commercial until the 1920s, but this Cleveland Discol racing fuel was the invention of one of the world's best remembered mechanical engineers, Harry Ricardo, who designed the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that was used in Spitfire fighters. And in his path-breaking book, 1923, The High-Speed Internal Combustion Engine, he said this: it's perfectly well known that alcohol is an excellent fuel. And he wasn't the only one. There are many people who had this same idea. The USDA and USGS ran studies in 1907, 1909 time frame, and they found that the high compression ethanol engines had the same relative fuel combustion as a gasoline engine despite the BTU difference, which meant that the bigger gas tank argument, that was refuted over a century ago in government studies. So today, when the oil industry claims that people are paying billions more because ethanol contains 30% less BTUs per gallon than regular gasoline, we know where to send them, right? Back to the history books. So by about 1920, it was pretty clear that alcohol was going to be the fuel of the future. This is an article from Scientific American. Shall the cornfields run our cars? You could run this same article today in Scientific American, and probably people wouldn't know the difference. Okay? Everybody loved alcohol fuel at the time. Alexander Graham Bell, in an article in National Geographic, said alcohol makes a beautiful, clean, and efficient fuel, manufactured even from corn stalks. So they were thinking ahead to non-food cellulosic biofuels. In fact, there was a lot of research along those lines that sort of started and then fell off and started again. That's an interesting thread of its own in this history that'll be a chapter in my book. Worldwide, there was very extensive use of ethanol blends. There was an early RFS in France, Germany, Italy, and Brazil. Mandatory blending laws. You had, if you're going to sell gasoline, you had an RFS in the 1920s and 30s in a lot of other countries. And then others like Sweden and Ireland and Poland and the UK had tax incentives. There was all kinds of feedstocks. So here's the question. If ethanol was winning the octane war in the years after World War I all over the world, what happened? What went wrong? Okay, so it's two things. It's leaded gasoline and it's prohibition. So here's, this is, of course, all around the world. So let's talk about prohibition just for a second. It was a social movement, and it was backed by both Henry Ford and John D. Rockefeller. But Ford hoped to turn breweries into fuel distilleries. He didn't think that it was appropriate to drink beverage alcohol. Neither did John D. Rockefeller, but regulations and corruption made fuel alcohol impossible during the 1920s, and Standard Oil did help with that. So it's a more complicated picture than what we, oftentimes think of, where you have, sort of the Rockefellers fueled, prohibition so that it would block fuel ethanol. And that's only partly true. But leaded gasoline was one of the big things. Leaded gasoline was invented in 1921 at GM's Dayton, Ohio research labs. By 1924, Standard Oil and GM had formed a corporation called Ethyl, as in ethyl alcohol, to produce TEL, tetraethyl lead. Charles Kettering was the research vice president of General Motors and worked on and directed anti-knock research and found a lot of different options. And some of his research staff published a paper in the Society of Automotive Engineers, June 1922, basically saying that alcohol is used rather extensively around the world. The internal memos show that they were very excited about it, and they'd already discovered leaded gasoline. And they thought ethanol was a great fuel. So what happened? Well, in part, there was a disaster, a refinery accident. Well, it wasn't really an accident because the refinery was very badly designed. They did not respect the toxic nature of this stuff, and at least 17 people died violently insane. And this is the picture you have to imagine of people being hauled off from work in straitjackets, literally true. Okay? It was a very dark chapter in the history of the American oil industry, one of the dark chapters. This was a Hearst. Now, the Hearst publications got a hold of this, and you can imagine they had a field day. This is what a field day looks like. It's a cartoon of a poor guy in a hospital bed going crazy, from leaded gasoline. So everybody knew this was bad stuff, and all the public health officials and scientists said, hey, you've got perfectly good alternatives. But Thomas Midgley and Charles Kettering turned around and said, oh, no, we don't. So far as science knows, tetraethyl lead is the only material that can be an anti-knock fuel. So that was not even stretching the truth. It was way beyond. And of course, they poured on the publicity. Change to ethyl, leaded gasoline. Interestingly, they also pulled a few sleight of hands in terms of technology. If you look at this chart very closely, one of the things you see is that there's something missing. This is from an anti-knock relative effectiveness compound study. And you can see that at the last minute, somebody didn't want to even admit that there was something called alcohol that could be used as an anti-knock. So that's how much the history of this industry has been obscured. But everybody, I hope by now, has seen this picture. Has everybody seen this? Does this look familiar? This is 1933 downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. We made a pilgrimage to this site a few years ago. It was a lot of fun. There's a parking lot there now, but it really is quite something. All the rest of the buildings are around it. This is the governor of Nebraska. They were promoting, corn alcohol. The same thing happened in other places. The Skelly Gasoline Company, also in Nebraska, corn alcohol gas, and over in Peoria, Illinois. And there's a bunch of others like this, and we don't really have enough of these. I would love to see young historians go after more of this kind of information. Where did they try this in the 1930s? What was it like? How did it come out? Here's another one from Ames, Iowa, 1935. Ames, of course, was the Iowa State Research Center for so much of what was going on with the alcohol fuels industry. So in the 1930s, there was a farm movement called Chemergy, and this was really sort of the Republican answer to FDR's farm programs. And the answer was this. Rather than limiting farm acreage and trying to boost prices through scarcity, why don't we find new uses for farm products? And so there was, for a while, a New Uses Council, the Chemergy, Farm Chemergic organization. There was a lot of things about this. Plastics from soybeans were very successful, and but the main thing was was ethanol, and it was very controversial in the 1930s. The oil industry kept saying it was not good for engines. You couldn't really use it as a fuel. It had a lot of problems, and all of it was hot air. It was just all market defensiveness. So Francis Garvin in 1936 says, they say we have foreign oil, how are we going to get it in case of war? Interesting question. Is that much defense for your children? So Garvin actually helped contribute to this plant in Atchison, Kansas, the Agrol plant. The Chemical Foundation and Henry Ford built this plant, and let's see, they rolled out the barrel when it came to new Agrol. I don't know if you can see this very well, but the pump that's furthest away from us has the sign Agrol. But there it is again. Try a tank full, you'll be thankful. You know, which is a, you know, good as any, better than some kind of, you know, kind of motto. You know, it's not a boastful motto. It's just a kind of quaint and wonderful. So this was a great experiment. There were 2,000 stations in the Midwest. There was a bitter fight with the oil industry. They went bankrupt in 1939, and everybody thought, well, they'd been licked. The oil industry had won. With all their propaganda and all their, you know, pulling strings and that sort of thing, the oil industry had won. And so what happens? World War II comes along, and there's a huge rubber shortage. And you might have heard about the scrap rubber drives of the 1940s. People were feeling like this was a pretty desperate problem. And of course, rubber came from Southeast Asia, which the Japanese had cut off with their invasions. And so what the Truman Committee found in 1942 was that Standard Oil Company, Exxon, had been engaged in what he called treasonous behavior by giving leaded gasoline technology to the Nazi chemical company IG Farben, and also blocking synthetic rubber in the U.S. Well, why does synthetic rubber have anything to do with the story? So you can make synthetic rubber, the kind that they made in World War II called the Buna S rubber, 4 different ways, 2 ways from oil, 1 way from coal, and 1 way from grain alcohol. So guess which way we ended up having to go with, because the oil industry blocked the petroleum-based technology. So by 1942, after a heroic effort in the Midwest, three quarters of all the military rubber came from grain alcohol. Can you imagine what would have happened if the war effort had been put back by a year because of Standard Oil's deal with the Nazis? So there's a lot of bias that surrounds the use of alcohol as a motor fuel, and it's been noted by people through the ages. Pleath was the chief chemist at the Discol Company. One can scarcely avoid the conclusion that the results arrived at are those best suited to the political or economic aims of the people doing the research. So in other words, scientific research is up in the air. For every PhD, there's an equal and opposite PhD. Okay. But in a democracy, in a free country, and I love this, Vannevar Bush is one of the leading technology visionaries of the 20th century, and he envisioned the World Wide Web. He envisioned a much better system for printing. There's a lot of things he did. He was FDR's science advisor, and excuse me. And his idea was that in a free country, people follow the path of technology that they choose. It's not chosen for them. Well, of course, just to round out the whole, the story here, we all lived through the energy crisis. So, and some of us, that was not me. This is from Gasohol USA, the guy pouring the mash over here. If you remember that magazine, Gasohol USA. But I remember those days. I worked on an ethanol plant, and it was an interesting time. And of course, the Clean Air Act of 1990 got a lot of things going, and that needs to be part of the story too. Look at the increase in the ethanol production volume, and also, and this is the lower right-hand side here, how much dirtier gasoline is getting and how much cleaner biofuels is getting. This is from a report that just came out from the Union of Concerned Scientists, so just last week, actually. Just came out. So many of you have already seen it, I know, but it's been going around. But that's a kind of an interesting conclusion of theirs. And so it's time for my conclusions. Ethanol's been in wide use for over a century. It was supported by automotive pioneers. The industry has a significant and very patriotic history that deserves to be better known. We need young historians, and I'm glad to help out with that. So just go ahead and email me, or you can look at my website. I've got a website on ethanol history that I've been putting together, and it's really environmentalhistory.org/ethanol, but if you just go to environmentalhistory.org, there's a link to this page as well. Okay, so thank you very much.
One more round of applause for Bill. Did you guys learn something? Yeah? I wasn't exaggerating when I said expert. You guys have flashbacks to college with him? A little bit. In a good way. In a good way. Now, that was fun for me. I'm a huge history buff, so seeing those old photos and some of those vintage ads was pretty neat. Next up, did you know when the RFS was enacted in 2005, America imported 60% of its fuel? But today we import only 24%. Quite a difference. Also, did you know in 2015 the ethanol industry contributed nearly $44 billion to the GDP? Pretty outstanding. Which brings us to our first panel. Mitch Miller is going to lead our first discussion. Don't get stuck in the gears, eliminating market barriers to ethanol. Now, Mitch has extensive involvement in the ethanol industry. He currently serves as the CEO and Managing Director for Carbon Green Bioenergy, LLC. He serves as the President of Iroquois Bioenergy Company, LLC, and, I don't know how you do it all, Managing Partner of New View Fuels. In addition to all of that, he's also a board member of Growth Energy. So please welcome to the stage, Mitch Miller.
We go way out where there ain't nobody. We turn this cornfield into a party.
I think my job is to take this seat right here, and then we're going to introduce our panel. We have a panel of experts as far as legislative and policy and experts that are going to join me right now. So I want to bring the whole group up. And I'll start by introducing the panel. First off, our industry faces a lot of challenges. Go ahead and take a seat, crew. And we have experts that are covering many aspects. And well, how do I start the video? Okay. Okay. And the great thing about this panel is they really have a deep passion for the industry. We've got a lot of experience. And we're going to start with the video, so go ahead and roll that, and then I'll move into bios.
Growth Energy continues to lead all efforts to knock down hurdles facing our industry in Washington and in state capitals across the country. Those include attempts to repeal the Renewable Fuel Standard, prohibitions on the sale of E15, Reid vapor pressure, or RVP, restrictions, state caps that prevent higher ethanol blends, and prohibitions on the use of corn ethanol. Last September, EPA Administrator Gina McCarthy spoke at the Growth Energy Advocacy Conference and stated EPA was committed to the statutory limits of the RFS. We filed significant comments with the EPA to uphold the statutory requirements of the RFS and are now part of major lawsuits to protect the RFS. Growth Energy is actively engaged in state efforts to remove restrictions on the sale of ethanol blends. We've engaged local advocates in California, Oregon, and Washington to counter their low-carbon fuel standards, experts in New York to remove their current 10% cap on ethanol blends, and in North Carolina to protect from a specific tax on higher ethanol blends. Growth Energy is also the leading voice of ethanol on Capitol Hill, thanks to dedicated members like you who take the time to come to Washington and advocate for our industry. Last year, more than 200 Growth Energy members participated in more than 500 congressional meetings during our 7 fly-ins and annual advocacy conference. We continued to expand our advocacy efforts beyond the Corn Belt focusing heavily on coastal representatives and senators because issues like clean air and consumer choice impact the entire nation. By continuing to reach outside the Corn Belt, we are finding new congressional allies on issues like the RFS and RVP. We also leveraged key partnerships with Fuels America, Vote Vets, and Americans United for Change, and others to highlight our nation's homegrown solution to our dangerous dependence on foreign oil. In 2015, our three key messages on Capitol Hill: first, the RFS is working and doesn't need to be changed. Second, we urge support of E15 and higher blends as fueling options. Third, RVP relief is needed to provide consumers with a choice and savings at the pump. The results were positive. No legislative changes were made to the RFS. Congressional offices are better informed and more supportive of E15. The RVP bill has 35 co-sponsors in the House of Representatives and 16 co-sponsors in the Senate and counting. In 2015, Growth Energy's advocacy, regulatory, and legal efforts continued to not only lead the ethanol industry, but move it forward. Despite the ongoing hurdles that our opponents place in front of us, we are poised to overcome many obstacles and have a successful 2016.
Okay, let me introduce our panel, and I'm going to start by reading their bios. Shay Sahay is Senior Regulatory Counsel in Washington, D.C., Office of Poet LLC. In that capacity, he manages the vast regulatory issues that face Poet as a leading supplier of ethanol and its co-products, including regulatory regulations of the renewable fuels market, transportation safety, feed products, international trade, and environmental compliance, among other areas. Amy Davis represents Novozymes, a global industrial biotechnology company, by the way, who donated 2 truckloads of enzymes and raised $600,000 last night. So much appreciated. Last year, when I think we raised $200,000 from a truckload of Novozymes, I thought that was really the high mark, and I was wondering how we were going to do that again. So great job. In this capacity, she leads the development and implementation of policy and regulatory strategies to secure and expand policies resulting in optimal market opportunities for Novozymes products. Christy Moore, KM Consulting, is a leading authority on motor fuel quality, regulatory, safety, and environmental aspects, specializing in renewable and alternative fuels. Moore recently worked on technical regulatory issues for the ethanol industry at a national trade association for the U.S. ethanol industry, where her primary focus was the commercialization of higher level ethanol blended fuels. Chris Bliley serves as Growth Energy's Director of Regulatory Affairs. Prior to joining Growth in 2011, Chris was the director at the Nussel Group, a Washington, D.C.-based consulting firm. John Fear is the Director of Governmental Affairs at Growth Energy, helping lead its efforts on Capitol Hill. Prior to joining Growth Energy, he spent 7 years on the staff of Senator Kent Conrad from North Dakota, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee, where he most recently served as Senator Conrad's budget analysis for agriculture and trade. So help me by welcoming them to the stage. So we're gonna roll through a series of questions and cover a wide variety of topics, and then we'll open it up to the crowd to fill in any questions at the end. So my first question is for Shay. Shay, can you tell us the status of the RVO lawsuit?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thanks, Mitch. Thanks for inviting me up here today, and thanks to the Growth Energy staff for a great conference so far. So the status of the RVO litigation is that Growth Energy and a group of biofuel supporting entities filed a challenge to the 2014 to 2016 RVOs on January 8th of this year. Now, our core argument in that lawsuit is that EPA exceeded its legal authority in its application of what we call the general waiver. And basically, the RFS, as you all know, sets required statutory volumes for renewable fuels to be blended into transportation fuels. What the general waiver allows EPA to do is when there's inadequate domestic supply, EPA is allowed to reduce the statutory volumes. What EPA did, though, was not just look at our industry's ability to supply renewable fuels. It went on and looked at factors such as distribution infrastructure and consumer demand for fuels when deciding to lower the volumes off the statutory levels. So what EPA did is both contrary to law and contrary to facts. One, we don't think the statute allows them to take into account these other non-supply factors from reducing volumes. And two, we think even when they did look at those factors, they looked at it wrong. And if you really look at the data, we think we can get renewable fuels out to vehicles in the short term. So that's the core of our argument. On the flip side, obviously, our oil interests, they not only support EPA's use of the general waiver, they think EPA should have gone further and reduced volumes even more. So really, you've got three sides. You've got us saying that the general waiver shouldn't have been used. You've got EPA defending its rule. Then you've got the oil interests saying EPA should have gone further. So moving forward, regarding the schedule, we're pushing for the case to be resolved this fall so that the 2017 RVO rule can take into account whatever the court decides the law is. For one reason or another, the other parties, EPA is unsure what it wants to do. The oil interests seem to not be supporting a faster schedule, and so we're working all that out. Again, it's our preference that the lawsuit be resolved prior to the 2017 rule. If we don't succeed in that, then the decision will probably come out in early 2017.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Shay, moving on to the next question. Briefly, what is the California Low Carbon Fuel Standard? Why should the industry be concerned? And how is Growth Energy working to stay in the largest fuel market in the United States?
Sure. So the Low Carbon Fuel Standard is a pretty different program from the RFS. What the LCFS does is it seeks to reduce what's called carbon intensity. Carbon intensity is the amount of CO2 equivalent that's associated with a fuel per unit of energy of that fuel. And more specifically, what the LCFS is looking to do is reduce the carbon intensity of fuels, transportation fuels in California, below a 2010 baseline by 2020. Now, the big issue with ethanol with the LCFS is that in 2010, ethanol was already at about 10% of the fuel in California. So we're part of the baseline. So in order for ethanol to contribute to emissions reductions or carbon intensity reductions, ethanol needs to beat ethanol. We need to reduce our carbon intensity below 2010 levels. Part of that problem is California doesn't allow E15 right now, so we're limited by that as well. So we've had process improvements, significant improvements in the industries over the last several years, but to really get significantly down below 2010 levels of our own fuel is a problem. And I think it's a real problem with the program in general, is how if ethanol can't solve the issue, then how are they really going to significantly reduce CI values? So I think that's the key problem with ethanol. As far as what Growth Energy is doing from a litigation perspective, we're involved in a pair of lawsuits over the LCFS. One lawsuit really centers around whether California has really looked at all the environmental impacts of the LCFS. So our analyses show that the LCFS will actually increase emissions of NOx or nitrogen oxides, which then which then lead to the formation of ozone, which is a pollutant that's bad for human health. So the LCFS actually leads to increased NOx, according to our analyses. California has never done an analysis of the NOx impacts of the LCFS. We think they are required to do so by law, and we also think it's fair that they disclose to the public that if they want to adopt this program, that they ought to tell the public about all the impacts of it, increased NOx versus what we think are some questionable analyses of greenhouse gas reductions. So that's the core of the state suit. The other suit is a federal suit, which focuses on federal constitutional issues and whether the LCFS runs afoul of those.
Okay, is there any other litigation that you'd like to touch on? Or
The other main thing that's going on right now is we've been involved with the tank car litigation. So essentially, PHMSA recently adopted a set of rules requiring more stringent safety regulations on tank cars. In general, we thought that there were some questionable safety benefits, but we actually chose to support PHMSA in the litigation because we appreciated that they gave ethanol tank cars a longer timeline to comply with the new rules than some other types of tank cars, and petroleum tank cars, which we thought was appropriate given we're less of a safety risk or environmental risk than the petroleum tank cars. In the end, Congress ended up codifying a bunch of the provisions that had been adopted in the final tank car rule. So we're staying in the litigation primarily to preserve a distinction between retrofit cars and new cars. Retrofit cars currently have to meet a slightly lower level of standards, which we think are appropriate. But I want to just say that Growth Energy's advocacy was really successful with this particular rulemaking. We were really engaged in the process, going into OMB, submitting sophisticated comment letters, following up with additional information to OMB. And what we saw was that the rule initially treated our industry unfairly on par with petroleum tank cars. And through strong advocacy, we were able to get a result that was much more favorable to us, and then which was ultimately adopted by Congress through legislation. So that was a real victory for Growth Energy.
Okay, thank you. Okay, moving on to Amy. Amy, can you explain the current challenges with the renewable fuel standard and give us a little bit of a lay of the land there?
Yeah, sure, I'd be happy to. Thanks for the question, and thanks to Growth Energy for inviting me to be on this panel, inviting Novozymes to be a part of this conference and this organization. I think we just want to say thank you to start off, and thanks to you for organizing this panel. I think it was great to have this wonderful introduction this morning from the historian. In many ways, the challenges are not that different today, obviously, than they've been in the past, and certainly not in the last 2 years. The RFS fight is still about market share. It's a battle for market share. In Washington, D.C., we get bogged down and sometimes confused by some of the other issues that we turn it into, food versus fuel, small engines, greenhouse gas reduction emissions. But at the end of the day, it's two industries fighting for market share. And one has control over the infrastructure and the other one's trying to break into that control. So I think that is still the primary issue. We have a couple of new entrants in the recent years, I think, that have complicated the issue. Lower gasoline consumption generally over the last year or two has created some new messaging points for the opposition. And then obviously the low price of oil right now has created also some challenges there. But I think, if you want to talk about leaders in this fight, I would say Growth Energy is at the top of that list. I mean, the organization, Tom Bias, his staff, really are trusted resources. They've got a long history in this area and obviously have an intense amount of knowledge from a regulatory and technical perspective that is really well respected. And there have been pioneers in Fuels America, and Fuels America is a coalition of stakeholders that have been fighting for the RFS. We've been very singularly focused on the RFS. It's important when you talk to members of Congress and other stakeholders in the decision-making world when it comes to policy to have a very clear, coordinated message. in a very clear, coordinated policy position, because without it, it's very easy to split the group, and we become more vulnerable. And Fuels America and Growth Energy has really been instrumental in making sure that that does not happen. And as everybody can see, we've been extremely successful in defending the RFS over the last few years.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move on to Christy. Christy, let's start with ASTM. We've got all these acronyms, so help us understand, what is ASTM, why is it important to this industry, and why is it important for us to participate in ASTM?
Sure thing. Thanks, Mitch. And I might be the happiest person to be here. Glad to be on the team, folks. What's ASTM? Well, it's like the single most powerful document for our industry, right? Because 99% of the product leaving our production facilities is manufactured to the parameters that are in the ASTM International specification. So for $75 a person, you get a voice and a vote, and you can come to ASTM and sit along our peers, our colleagues, oil, auto, state regulators. We all sit in a room and we hash through what parameters are needed for fuels so that they work in all the vehicles and all the engines. Right now, we're warding off some attacks. Citgo has placed a stake in the ground and said that as increasing ethanol content's being added to gasoline, proportionately, they think we need to ratchet down sulfate content or chloride content, or these other, I would consider them non-performance type requirements, and we just don't think the science is there. We don't think that sulfate issues were directly proportional to any performance issues. We think that was more of a regional, maybe a fuel additive incompatibility issue that we had back in the mid-2000s. And so as we're pushing hard to get E15 recognized in the gasoline spec and to have it treated equally as E10 at ASTM, we're having to ward off some significant attacks from our customers.
Okay, so pay your $75, you then have a voice, and this is one of the issues. There's how many people sitting around the table at ASTM?
We've got just shy of 2,000 people in Committee DO2 that does all petroleum products, liquid fuels, lubricants. In Subcommittee A, where we're very active, Sean Van Holzen, Chuck Core, Chris Bliley, we're very active. There's a couple hundred people in the room. We have about 12 ethanol people in the room. And so the votes come down, it's a majority vote.
So we need
have these changes.
one person from every plant, and we've had this discussion at our plant, to sign up for ASTM and build out that coalition of voices. I think that may be really a key topic that we're covering in this panel. So we encourage you to do that. So what about ASTM and how does it affect higher level blends beyond E15, mid-level blends, E85, other blends?
Right, we're really trying, so EPA really only regulates a couple of things. EPA regulates benzene and sulfur content year-round, and they regulate vapor pressure primarily in the summer only. Every other parameter is pseudo-regulated by ASTM standards, National Conference Weights and Measures standards that are adopted at the state level. Sometimes they show up in your terms and conditions of your sales contracts, your commercial contracts. That's how these standards organizations actually affect our business. And it's in the trade and flows of our business. Even terminals can adopt ASTM standards that you must meet these for you to enter the fungible system. And so we're working with those organizations to help define our fuels, not restrict our fuels, but to help define them so that we can proliferate them, so that we're not artificially putting handcuffs on our fuels like the state of California adopts into its regs, thou shalt not put more than 10% ethanol in our gasoline, when quite frankly we know all the benefits of E15. It's the most studied fuel in decades. And we've got some of these artificial boundaries. New York is another great example. We're working hard to remove those types of barriers. But importantly, we've got huge markets like Texas and Florida and the Carolinas. We heard from the panelists yesterday on E15. They're moving these products into the market. There's zero issues. They work extremely well in the cars. And so we've got to be diligent to ensure that we're not artificially handcuffed so that we grow, the ethanol content in gasoline.
Okay, thank you. We'll move on to Chris Bliley. We know the EPA and the decisions they make impact our businesses, but what other federal agencies play a role in the ethanol industry?
Sure. Thanks, Mitch, and thanks everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. It's a great turnout. So I will throw that out there to begin. We've all touched on bits and pieces of it. EPA and obviously the RFS, but Department of Transportation. Shay talked about the tank car regulations. That is one subset of the Department of Transportation that impacts anybody who ships ethanol or DDGs by rail. I think most of you all are familiar with the changes. Shay talked about, what's coming down the line for ethanol tank cars. The other side of the Department of Transportation deals with, highway transit safety. I think Ken Field yesterday asked about flex fuel vehicles. Well, automakers were getting 1.2 miles per gallon credit from the Department of Transportation to make FFVs. And when you're in a competitive marketplace and you're bound by these, mileage standards, 1.2 miles per gallon is very, very meaningful to an automaker. And that's one of the main reasons that they continue to produce. But those credits get phased out by 2017. So they're in a situation where they've got to figure out what they do to meet sort of the more stringent compliance requirements. So DOT has a major role in how we, not only how we market fuel from a logistics standpoint with tank cars, but again with the end user at the automobile. Another sort of switching more to plant operations is the FDA, Food and Drug Administration. So several years ago, Congress approved the Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA. We love acronyms, so we'll throw another one out there. As part of that, they have a number of requirements for anybody who produces animal feed. Well, for the first time ever, our plants, because of DDGs, are being swept into those requirements. And so to meet those requirements, we're in the process of putting together a turnkey compliance plan. As part of Growth Energy, we've worked with a number of plants and sort of an advisory board. We've got a webinar next week to go over all of this. But just out of curiosity, how many knew that they were subject to FSMA compliance? Yeah, not pretty low number. So this is a really important thing for plants to be aware of and one to really get involved in. Amy talked about gasoline consumption. That's the Department of Energy. They track that, and we all sort of track that just from it's good to know. But EPA has to use EIA's numbers when they set, when they set the annual RVO. So, I can't just say, well, it looks like people are driving more and using more gasoline. I mean, these are federal agencies that have a key role in virtually every aspect of what we do as an industry.
So with E15 in 23 states, what is Growth Energy doing to help prevent restricted access and open more access for E15?
Sure. And Christy did a great job outlining the importance of ASTM. I think what a lot of people don't realize is these states defer to ASTM for their fuel regulations, if they even have fuel regulations. So rather than saying, let me back up. So you have a number of states that actually control ethanol content. Christy mentioned California, New York, Arizona, I think Nevada's another. So these are states that specifically write into their law that you can't use more than 10% ethanol. New York, we're in the process. We've engaged local advocates up there to try and change that, to remove that cap. And again, we're not requiring retailers to carry E15. This is purely if, New View Fuels operates on Long Island if they want to carry E15. So those are the kind of restrictions we're trying to remove. As you can imagine, folks who aren't fans of E15 are doing the opposite. They'll throw out the small engine claims, they'll throw out boating claims, and are preventing us from removing these caps. Again, we're not requiring anybody to sell E15. This is purely if retailers and consumers want a choice at the pump. So we're doing that. Christy and I and several others met yesterday to talk about, even in the states where we are selling E15, there are things that are on the books that really need to be changed. And so we can continue to move forward and retailers have certainty about what the law is and what the law is going to be. Labeling varies from state to state. So we're involved in all of those details, both at ASTM, both with state regulators and federal regulators as well.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about what's happening in Oregon and Washington, and will these markets end up like California?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. Shay did a really good job outlining the low carbon fuel standard. Oregon just adopted, they chose a new name, Clean Fuel Standard. It's a little bit different than California because they took better land use change numbers. I think everybody's familiar that we get penalized as Midwestern grain ethanol for land use, indirect international land use change, and Brazilian ethanol gets a better score when it comes to land use change. And so there's this sort of disincentive to use Midwestern grain ethanol. Oregon did a better job analyzing some of the more recent data from Oregon National Lab about greenhouse gas reductions of ethanol. But that said, as Shay outlined with a baseline issue, it still disincentivizes Midwestern grain ethanol to be used in the Oregon market. The other thing you run into, obviously, California is a huge fuels market, and if you're a neighboring state, it's just much easier for people to say, well, we'll just use California gas. And it just sort of starts that way and keeps building. Same thing in Arizona. They use carb fuel. Washington is a little bit further behind. They've, instead of a clean fuel or low carbon fuel standard, they've opted to do more of a cap and trade type program just on manufacturing in the state of Washington. They are still interested in clean fuel standard, and obviously if you've got, from a geographic standpoint, you've got California and you've got Oregon, and British Columbia actually has a different program as well. There's an interest, obviously, on the Pacific Coast. So we're maintaining a strong presence there and keeping an eye on Washington and involved in California and Oregon as well.
Okay, thank you, Chris. We'll move on to John. John, what are the most pressing challenges, and I'm assuming we're going to talk about policy here with John, in Washington, D.C., and how are we positioning as Growth Energy and as our industry in DC?
Well, I think Amy really hit the nail on the head with the RFS. That's always going to be our most pressing challenge in Washington, is how we defend the RFS and how we position ourselves in Congress on that issue. You've got a united front on the other side of this issue between the oil industry, food manufacturers, livestock and poultry groups, anti-government groups. So they're trying to form a coalition to call for repeal or reform of the RFS. So that's the first one. I think the new thing that we've done over the past year or so is, as we've been working with retailers, and Mike O'Brien and his team have been trying to figure out what hurdles exist to get E15 in the marketplace, we've come across how pervasive and how prevalent the RVP restrictions during the summer fueling season are going to hinder this adoption from June 1 to September 15th. So that's something we've really taken up and we've really pushed on Capitol Hill this year. It's not an RFS related issue. It's something completely separate. It has to deal with how a fuel marketer markets E15. And giving some sort of parity between how you market E10 and how you market E15 is going to be instrumental in getting that adopted in the marketplace.
Okay, what can Growth members do to help the policies that open the fuel market for ethanol?
I think one of the top things that you can do, and we get a very good participation, is attend our fly-ins, engage policymakers when they're back home in your state or your district. That's really the top thing, is they need to hear from you. One thing that Tom touched on briefly yesterday in his conversation is be engaged politically too. The key component here is just to make sure that they know that you're around and you're interested in them. And then I think the final thing that I would consider is if you have any questions, reach out to us, and we can help provide you with answers on how you might be able to do things as well.
So a little bit back to the RVP waiver and what's we're trying to push through Congress. We have how many names on the bill? I think it's do do we have a House bill and a Senate bill, or just?
We have a House bill and a Senate bill. The House bill has, I believe, 35 people on the bill, which is a pretty good number. And we have people on that bill who both are traditional, we love ethanol supporters, and we have people on that bill who are not really so much ethanol supporters, but they see the problem with marketing things where you can't actually market it for 3.5 months of the year, and how they view that as a problem, and that's not actually a free marketplace. In the Senate, we have about 16 people, and we've just done a lot of work behind the scenes, really building attention to this issue, and we've worked a lot with people, particularly representatives and senators, in states where we are having E15 rolled out. That's where we've targeted. We've targeted a lot those areas, actually more than we've targeted the Corn Belt, because this is where the fuel is going to be sold. And these are the areas that will have this issue impact them.
Can you comment on second-generation production tax incentives and what the future of that policy looks like?
Sure. So this is for anybody who does second-generation technology. There is a $1 credit for second-generation fuels. This is for people who want to use corn stover, corn fiber, algal fuels, things like that. This policy for the last 4 or 5 years has been extended on a year-by-year basis. And last year, Congress, they essentially phased out the biggest energy tax incentives that were included in what was called the Tax Extenders Bill for wind and solar. So moving forward, now you're going to see probably more of an effort to figure out some way to combine biofuels tax incentives, alternative fuels tax incentives, to be a little bit more comprehensive in nature and maybe have some sort of a longer-term extension. Now, none of that's written in stone, but it's really key that when that happens, it does not choose winners and losers in terms of fuel. There needs to be a balance in how that's done, and I think that there's a way to get that done, and this is still a long ways away from happening, but that's where I think this is moving, is you're going to have an effort to combine and make things a little bit more comprehensive and maybe extend for a longer term. I think there will be that effort. Whether that succeeds or not, I don't know, but that's where I think this is moving.
Okay. I appreciate all the comments, and what we'd like to do now is open it up for questions. I know we covered a lot of ground there, but are there any questions from the crowd here? And I'm assuming that we're carrying a couple mics around.
Mitch, can I just add quick while we're waiting for the first question, to follow on what John was talking about and what can you all do? I think John was spot on. You all are the best ambassadors for this industry, and frankly, in my opinion, for any industry there is in Washington, so thank you for that. Keep it up. I think it's important to add to that, there are a whole lot of stakeholders for this industry up and down the value chain, and we need to engage them. They are just as incentivized for this industry to be successful as we are, and they carry weight as well. I would also say, make sure that you're talking to the influencers of your members of Congress, people who are helping the decision makers make their decisions beyond just this industry, and paint a picture for them. Paint a picture, follow on to Tom's quote he made yesterday. What could the world look like? And make sure you emphasize the gap between what it looks like today and what that future could look like for all of us. So really, don't just think about the members of Congress, think about the people who influence them in your communities, and branch out to your stakeholders that you talk to every day along the value chain that have a stake in this success as well.
Completely agree. Thank you.
Good morning. I just wanted to get a little more into the ASTM. Does it just has to be a plant that can join, or can other vendors join? And please explain that a little bit more.
Sure thing. ASTM is an international standards developing organization, and anyone can be a member. There's no restrictions to, what you do for a living. Your employment. You'll be categorized by your employment, though. Like I work for the producer category. There's a regulatory category. There's a consumer category, and so you'll be categorized. But at this point, we just need to grow our numbers, because it's going to come down to how many votes do we have and whether we can fend it off. We were successful in establishing a partnership with our customers, the oil industry, with the autos, and with the state regulators, passed our E15 ballot, which we've been working on for 5 years. We've been slow walked by Mr. Gasoline for 5 years trying to get this ballot through. When we finally did get it passed through the couple of hundred people at the subcommittee level, we were stopped by the Engine Manufacturers Association trying to kick up some dust and some questions about E15 and its viability, and we actually lost strictly on a majority vote. We didn't have enough people in the room to stand up and say, this is a good thing, we've already ironed out the details, E15 needs to be, this language needs to be in the standard. So it was very frustrating, but we have all kinds of opportunities. We've got major ballots happening right now. We're in a deep discussion about whether 85 octane should still be in the marketplace. There hasn't been a car manufactured since 1984 that has included anything below 87 octane in the owner's manual. So if we think about the battles that we've had on Capitol Hill about E15 maybe or maybe not being in the owner's manual, there hasn't been a car on the road since I was in high school that has had 85 octane in the owner's manual. So if you think that there's any liability, I think is the word that they were using, for warranty claims, that's the number one right there. We're fighting some great, discussions on RVP. We're trying to actually codify, because the difference between 9-pound and 10-pound gasoline in a Tier 2 vehicle is not distinguishable. We're trying to actually codify in the ASTM standard these increasing amounts of vapor pressure, not only for ethanol fuels, for an all hydrocarbon fuel, because the vehicles will operate successfully on them. Okay, so we've got a great discussion going on there. We've got several other ballots where we're trying to broaden the scope of some of these documents, and understand that the use of ASTM standards in our hope is to not be limited to our domestic markets. We're going to take all that information and go out onto the world and use our ASTM experience, use the U.S. model to break into markets like Mexico and China and India, and the Philippines and Thailand. We're going to take the information and the knowledge that we have here, and we're going to put it out on a global scale, and our products should proliferate at that point.
Kurt, I'd just add, to Christy explained it well, so our opponents at ASTM, well, sometimes opponents, sometimes customers, they're large integrated companies, and so they get multiple votes because it's holding company, logistics company, it's all part of one global stream, but it just adds to the importance of your question, that you don't necessarily have to be, a plant and a vote. If you're a vendor or supplier, you guys need to get involved where you can.
Importantly, the 85 octane, so there's 5% of the market is 85 octane, but if you live in Denver, right, that is your lowest choice. It's probably a good fuel, but the owner's manual of the cars say no. And so we're going through all kinds of statistical analysis to prove whether or not a vehicle can tell the difference by running 85 octane at 10,000 feet versus running 85 octane at sea level. And so we're having a very robust scientific discussion on that. But at the same time, we're also having a great discussion on E15. When 70% of the cars on the road today actually condone and promote, recommend, that's what it's called, the fuel recommendation section of your owner's manual, it recommends E15. We've got retailers that are offering at higher octane and exceptional value to the consumer. And so things like ASTM shouldn't be in our way. Our goal is, Chris and I and our regulatory team, our goal is to knock down all the regulatory barriers to give you folks, the marketplace, the exercise and the freedom and the flexibility to do whatever you need to do to get the fuels into the market. It's no different than the FTC. We've got a new FTC rule on ethanol labeling that we sat down yesterday with Mark DeVries and Michael Bryan and our team to sit and make sure that what we're doing on a regulatory basis works for the marketplace. If we don't, then we may not be asking the right questions.
It's ironic, we have 85 octane in the marketplace without recommendation in your owner's manual and all the warranty stream that goes along with this. And we've had how many challenges with E15 and warranties.
Yep.
So it's just very ironic.
There's been no claims, because I'm sure we would hear of them. I run E15 in my Yukon. It loves it. Absolutely loves it.
Are there any further questions? Well, if not, I just want to thank the panel for their dedication to this industry and the passion that you bring to your jobs every day. And you know, there's a lot of us are working for companies, but this group up here is working every day for our industry, which is really a higher calling, and I really appreciate that, and I know our crowd does too. So help me by thanking them for putting in their time.
Yes, absolutely. I think that was a good first panel. Interesting look on what you guys are doing to overcome the obstacles that are in ethanol's path. Our next factoid, China was actually our second largest ethanol export market in the fourth quarter of 2015. Speaking of, to find out what else is going on globally with ethanol, Growth Energy board member Ray Deffinbaugh is going to lead our next panel discussion, Ethanol on the World Stage. Now, Ray is a founding member, president, CEO, and chairman of Big River Resources, LLC, a tri-state ethanol organization with facilities in Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. He also sits on the board of Absolute Energy, LLC, is a delegate to the U.S. Grains Council, and is a member of the National Grain and Feed Association. So, to lead our second panel of the day, please welcome to the stage Ray Deffinbaugh.
Morning, everyone. I don't know how you showered this morning, but I know you showered last night if you went to the Whisper Creek. So we've got a nice panel here. It's going to allow individual presenters to answer some questions, both some questions that are prepared and the opportunity for you to ask the questions as well. I think all of these panels, the presentations yesterday, exemplify to me and make me feel good about what we're doing here and elsewhere, in that if you study any successful business or individual, there's three qualities that stand out. One is a passion for what they do, and you've probably seen a lot of passion here. That historian, I think, had pretty good passion, and most of you folks I know personally, and you carry that same passion. The other is a good work ethic, and the roots that a lot of us bring here brings that work ethic. You know, time is the most valuable asset every one of us have. If you think not, go visit a nursing home or somebody on their deathbed and ask what they would give for just a little more time. So when you give your time to something like this, you're giving us your most valuable asset, and that work ethic carries through on that and shows the success of our industry. And the other thing is to be focused. And I think on this panel here, we're focusing on trade, and I hope you enjoy what we've got to present for you here. So with that, I'd like to introduce the panel in this order. Joel Williams, come forward. Joel's a manager for ethanol trading at ADM. He's been in the ethanol department at ADM for nearly 6 years and is currently responsible for their ethanol export program. Jun Yang or referred to more commonly as JJ. JJ is a deputy director in China for the U.S. Grains Council, where he focuses on ethanol trade. Prior to joining the council, JJ was an agriculture specialist at Agriculture Affairs Office at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing for 12 years. Paul Trupo. Paul's responsible for the analysis of trade data and trade opportunities as it relates to increasing exports of U.S. agricultural products, including biofuels. Prior to this position, Mr. Trupo served as the branch chief for the Foreign Agriculture Service sugar, dairy, and import programs. Amit Sakhdev. He serves as South Asia, which includes India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. Representative for the U.S. Grains Council, where he provides end users with updates on U.S. commodity prices and acts as a liaison with the traders in the region for importing U.S. commodities. Mark Markowitz. He's co-founder of Marcus Energy in 2005, where he served as the CEO and president. In addition to co-founding Marcus Energy, Mark co-founded Marcus Management and other affiliated entities which serve an important role in the ethanol production process at the facility. He is also a board member of Growth Energy. Would you give these folks a good hand? We've got a video. Before we do, I want to say what I like about this industry. If you think about the various people that make up this, the components of this panel, other panels that we've had, other presentations we've had, we've got people that are working their own areas independently. But if you remember the story that I've told you repeatedly about the raccoons and how raccoons can survive if they're not fighting amongst themselves, and for this industry to cohesively work together for a common goal or remain focused, I think this panel and other panels exemplifies that a great deal. So we'll have the video now.
In 2014, Secretary Vilsack stood before Growth Energy members and committed to opening international markets for American ethanol.
And we want to engage in that discussion. We want to use our resources to begin educating officials in those countries and business leaders in those countries about the enormous opportunity that we have in the United States for export potential.
Growth Energy has partnered with the U.S. Grains Council and the Renewable Fuels Association to create the Ethanol Foreign Market Development Steering Committee, consisting of members of each organization and senior U.S. Department of Agriculture Foreign Agricultural Service officials. With ethanol and DDG exports representing about 10% of industry sales value, it is of critical importance that we actively explore potential new markets and pursue solutions to trade barriers. The steering committee focuses on providing educational information related to ethanol to our overseas representatives and customers, including USGC and Foreign Agricultural Service staff, initiating market assessment missions and engaging with current customers to expand foreign demand through a combination of overseas trade activities and bringing foreign ethanol industry teams to the U.S. Teams from the three organizations have participated in exploratory market development missions to China, India, Japan, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Philippines, Singapore, and South Korea to ascertain the potential to expand the export market for U.S. ethanol. Additional missions are in the planning stage for 2016. These efforts have been a resounding success. In calendar year 2014, the industry had a record volume of DDG sales overseas and the second highest amount of ethanol exports in history. In 2015, U.S. exports of ethanol totaled 835.6 million gallons, which exceeded the total export volume of 2014. DDG exports totaled 12.6 million metric tons in 2015, another record, with an export value of $2.9 billion. Growth Energy is working hard to ensure that these numbers continue to grow in 2016 by expanding foreign market development efforts through additional market analysis and development missions.
All right. If it's all right with the panelists, I'd like to start out with a general question for you. Whoever wants to answer may, even if all want to answer at one time or another, and then we'll go to individual questions to individual panelists. So the general question is the Ethanol Export Steering Committee partnership that includes Growth Energy, U.S. Grains Council, and RFA an effective tool for promoting greater ethanol exports? Anyone can take that.
I think that's a wonderful idea to have the domestic industry and the U.S. Grains Council, which is working in the international arena, to come together to provide that information. The learning curve that U.S. has learned to the international buyers to take that forward. I think, as Secretary Vilsack said, the learnings that have happened in the U.S., it's important to tell that to the world so that the world can absorb the ethanol that is produced in the U.S. and go out into the world market. I think that's very important.
If I may add, I think the partnership is an outstanding initiative in that opening new markets in foreign countries it's not always a strictly market-driven export opportunity. It often requires changes in regulatory systems. We need to influence policymakers. Unlike other commodity markets where consumer demand will be a driving force behind new imports, in this case, it requires the public-private partnership in that the USDA, through the Secretary, our overseas posts, and our cooperators on the ground in the Grains Council, we often have access to foreign policymakers, decision makers, while the private sector, the technical experts, Mark and others that have traveled overseas can provide the technical expertise, work with the local industry, who then can put pressure on their policymakers from the ground up. So it really has been a very effective and productive partnership.
Other answers, perhaps?
Ray,
Mark?
I'd be happy to comment on behalf of the Board of Directors of Growth Energy. We, a few months back, decided that foreign market development needed to be another prong of our major activities. And Jeff Broin, our chairman, appointed a committee. I chair the committee. Ray, Steve Blyle, Jim Miller, Wes Clark, and Tom Bias as assistants. We've put together a group of parameters. I'll say the first thing we did was establish a goal. That goal is 2 billion gallons of exports by 2022. A few of our more aggressive members want to call it 4 by 24. So if you think about, we were at 830 million gallons a year ago in exports, 830 million going to 2 billion in the next 5 or 6 years. While it might seem aggressive, we think it's a very important step, and our board ratified this on Saturday at our in-person board meeting here. We have decided that this approach to cooperation with the group that Ray laid out, and primarily supporting the activities of the Grains Council. They have a lot of staff and facilities around the world that we can, rather than duplicate, we can coordinate with that group, and with individual activities from groups. I'll say Marcos Energy on my family's side of the business is aggressively seeking to go to those markets. I've been in China twice in the last 2 months. I'm going to be there again in April. I think that's a big market. When you think about that, we have 330 million people in the United States. China has 1.3 billion. India has 1.1 billion. They have a lot of the same air quality issues that we had maybe in Los Angeles in the 70s. And I think they're, along with a lot of the issues with climate change that came to light in Paris, in the COP21, I think there's a general realization that ethanol can be a very important tool to improving air qualities in these very highly populated areas. And so the demand could be just exponentially large for our industry, for our organization. And I'm very excited that our board has embraced exports as another prong to, we've done a lot of great work on Prime the Pump and the waiver for E15 and a lot on the advocacy front. But I want to assure the members of this organization, and we really appreciate the dues-paying members of the organization, and we want you to know as a board that we take very seriously our responsibility to spend your dollars wisely and to provide oversight and to spend them in the areas we really feel strongly will give us new markets and a brighter future. And so I think that's an activity that's got a lot of enthusiasm behind it on the growth energy side. And so be assured that we're watching your dollars. We appreciate your dollars. They're necessary. And this is a tough time in the business, but this is the time to stay the course and work hard on these issues that can make a brighter future for not only the generation of us that have been around the last decade or so, but the generations to come in the ethanol space.
Thank you, Mark. Other comments? The alliance that is being made with Growth and RFA and the Grains Council, the Grains Council is not really a producer of ethanol, so they are a perfect group to promote ethanol and DDG sales because they have no bias one direction or the other. But one thing the Grains Council does encourage is more involvement by those that have skin in the game. That would be, in our instance, ethanol producers. So I think everyone here, whether you're a producer of ethanol or an enzyme manufacturer or whatever your vocation or your company is involved with, is welcome on the Grains Council. Is that a fair statement? So while you're listening to this panel, you might want to look into that if you're not already a member. The U.S. ethanol exports account for about 6% of total domestic ethanol production. Why is increasing exports important to the industry? Just a general question, so whoever.
Well, I'll jump on that first, steal some of their thunder. As Mark alluded to, 95% of the world's population is outside the U.S. borders. 84% of the world's gross domestic product. And not only are these foreign markets, many of them in the developing countries particularly, are growing faster than the United States. We've heard about the slowdown in China, but they're still projected to grow at 5% growth. India at 7%, the Africa continent at 7%. Just India and China alone are expected to put 300 million new households ascending to the middle class for the first time over this decade. These families that are joining the middle class for the first time will have disposable income, able to purchase an automobile. So where transport fuel consumption in the U.S. is relatively flat, in many developing countries, it continues to increase. So as Ray alluded to, there's 6% of our export or our production has gone to export. There is enormous potential outside our borders, both due to economic growth and population growth, middle class growth, and it's an opportunity that we can't afford to miss.
Anyone?
Just to add to that, the gasoline demand in India is increasing by about 4% per annum, which is much higher than what it is increasing in the U.S., I think. And it was the only first time in about 5 years that the car sales went down for the first time in January. But it has been growing, and more people are going out and buying cars. But our biggest problem, I think, is the clean air that we don't have. And that's the reason why it is important that we start working in India to look at the Clean Air Act and everything else. Whatever U.S. has done in the past, I think that needs to be replicated in other parts of the country, of the world.
And also, we need exports in our country just to bridge the gap. We need exports out of our country because we don't have the right laws in place, the right, everything doesn't fit together for advanced ethanol, blends of 15% and more. So we need this export market to continue to balance our supply-demand equation. And, you know, it's kind of insane when you think about it that the U.S. has been exporting ethanol over to the Arabian Gulf over the last few years because our own country, we can't figure out how to use all this homegrown clean fuel ourselves. So I think it's going to continue to be a challenge legislatively in the U.S. We're going to continue to have export markets and continue to have them growing as our industry continues to grow.
Very well. Any other comments? We'll start off with an individual question here for Paul. Paul is director of the FAS Global Policy and Analysis Division. What do you view as the industry's major opportunities to increase ethanol exports?
Well, we've touched on some of those, the growing foreign demand for transport fuel. That's where we see most of the growth in biofuels. You know, even if we achieve our E15, E85 goals, foreign market demand for ethanol should outstrip even that. You know, I like to think of the foreign marketplace as sort of being into 4 different categories. There are those countries that are high transport fuel consumers but have anti-ethanol policies. China, India, Japan are some examples. If we could just get them to adopt even just a E5 mandate or blend rate, that would signify billions of gallons of new ethanol demand. A second category of countries which requires a different approach in the market development are those that are relatively small transport fuel consumers but have favorable biofuel policies. Some examples would be Colombia, Peru, Philippines, where they're trying to develop their domestic industry, but yet are backfilling their shortages with imports primarily from the United States. So that's another area of opportunity. And there's a third category of those countries out there who don't know what ethanol is and have no intention or have taken no time to look at it as an alternative transport fuel, and they require yet a different approach to developing those markets. And we talked about the difficulty of educating the consumers in the United States from moving to an E10 to an E15. But in some of these foreign markets, the education process is moving them from an E0 to an E5 or maybe from an E3 to an E10. So we talked about the challenges of education. And then the fourth category is what I just call the wild cards. We have Brazil, as you know, the second largest producer, second largest consumer of ethanol, but yet it's our second largest export market. In 2011, they were, I believe, our largest export market. They had a little bit of a drought and high prices, which provided a lot of export opportunities for us, not only to Brazil, but to other countries. So they're an opportunity out there. And the other wild card is the European Union, who has a huge demand for ethanol, but has applied very protectionist policies on its ethanol producers. We have dubious anti-dumping duties imposed on us. And one thing we're doing in Europe is we're negotiating a free trade agreement, TTIP, the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership, where if all goes well, and I'm sure it's going to be a long-term process, we're fighting for the elimination of all tariffs. We also have the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which we recently finished negotiating, which is with Congress, hasn't been approved yet, but it eliminates tariffs on ethanol with our 11 partner countries. So that's just a little bit about the opportunities that we have in our foreign market.
Very well. Thank you, Paul. I'm going to combine two questions for the next two panelists, Mark and Joel. The first question, and you can answer them together or separately, which markets do you believe offer the greatest opportunity for increased sales? And secondarily, can the U.S. industry meet the ethanol production demand that could occur if exports doubled in the next 5 years while still fulfilling our domestic market demand? And Mark and Joel, you can answer either one, both, or in any order you want.
Let's say, as far as countries that provide us the biggest demand and the biggest, quickest way to get more exports, it's the obvious China and India and, Mexico, maybe a year or two down the road. Mark, do you have any other countries?
Yeah, I'll say I think Jim Miller, and I want to give Jim a pat on the back. Jim's got expertise he's developed over years, and he's been instrumental in advising our panel on analysis of the world markets, and I think he's laid out 6 major companies. The 3 that Joel mentioned, I think, are kind of the leaders. I know at Marcos Energy, we're focusing on China. We've hired 2 staff people, one in China that speaks English and one in the U.S. that speaks Chinese, and we're going to aggressively go into that market not only as a company, but also in my role on this committee. We're excited that there is a lot upside there. I think we've all been a little frustrated that it's taken as long to bring E15 down the road. From the time we got the waiver, I think we all thought within a year or two we could see major market development from E15. It's taken longer. Probably the stumbling blocks put in front of us by our competitors in oil have slowed us some there. I personally believe that we may be able to grow exports even more quickly than we can grow the domestic market. But I think it's great to have a 2-pronged attack, and but I think some of the early focus is going to be on China. I mentioned I was in China, I think it was December 10th. I was there on the day the red alert came out for their air quality. And I can tell you that you could see skyscrapers 3 or 4 blocks away that you could barely make out their outline because the air was so yellow with what looked like yellow fog. It's a serious problem. They know it's a serious problem. I think they're going to address it. I think it's going to be an opportunity not only for our agricultural sector to supply them with ethanol to clean up their tailpipe emissions, but also I think it's an opportunity for their agriculture sector as well. And I think the more that we help them to embrace ethanol, not only from a kind of selfish aspect for our U.S. ethanol industry, but kind of on a more worldwide and global view, that ethanol can be some answers to their agricultural profitability as well as improvement of their air quality. And the message I've gotten directly from people I've talked to in China, both in their government and in their private sector, is that if we can help them to realize ethanol benefits to their agriculture as well as to their air quality, they think their government will embrace higher blends, especially in the Beijing area, where I think they could go from a 2% blend to 5%, or I shouldn't say blend, but usage in a 10% blend, and it would be a huge new market for them and us as well. So I think we've got to kind of look at what other people need, not only what we need, and what's kind of the greater good. And so I think China, India, they're big markets that we really need to help those people with their research, the technology, the logistics, and so I think our work with the Grains Council, Ray's on the A team, Ray's on our committee. I think we've got the right interaction and the right motives and to help each other and not duplicate each other and spend our dollars wisely. And I think I'm very excited about what it could mean to our industry here in the next 4 or 5 years.
Thank you, Mark and Joel. And then as a follow-up, can Yankee ingenuity meet the demand through adequate production? Either one.
I'd say absolutely. We've already proved that in the United States. When there's demand, our industry will respond and can increase production, relatively fast compared to the rest of the world. And new plants can be built in a year or 18 months. So if the demand's there, I have no doubt that the U.S. corn farmers and in the United States producers will produce more ethanol and grow the feedstock.
Very well. My next question is for JJ. What are the major challenges the U.S. faces in accessing the Chinese ethanol market?
Okay. First of all, I will say I'm happy to be here. Got invitation by Growth Energy. Question about what kind of a challenge for U.S. ethanol. I will say talking about the market, how marketplace. So far, what China is importing ethanol just because it's U.S. ethanol is price competitive. I think in the future, it's important to see, make sure U.S. corn and U.S. ethanol is competitive over other suppliers. So, for example, I remember very clearly several years ago, we are talking to Chinese energy officials want to make sure they consider ethanol for blending, for using imports. At that time, they mentioned, they gave us questions, how you can prove that U.S. corn, the price is reasonable, and I'll even there's like a futures market for ethanol. We can consider that, then we can make a decision to make a change to use ethanol as kind of addition to China's transportation fuel. So I would say number one for U.S. ethanol market access in China is to be sure to be competitive. So far, I think U.S. ethanol is doing well over other suppliers.
So, JJ, in 2015, China greatly increased their imports of U.S. ethanol. So the question comes to mind, is this market growth sustainable, or is it a short-term experiment by that country, by the Chinese country? Your opinion.
Okay. I would say China's import of ethanol just happened in recent 2 years. At the very beginning, it's a kind of experiment for sure, because at that time, the petroleum company, they got kind of a project they want to figure out if importing ethanol, whether from U.S. or from Brazil, is feasible, or if there's pricing or port handling capacity, if it works. In the end, I think those kind of project works very successfully. That happened, to early 2014. Then later we see other kinds of they call experimental experiments by different petroleum companies and by some domestic fuel ethanol producers. So far, I would say now it's not experimental stage. The trade is happening. So we just need to follow how it goes. From last year, what will happen in 2016.
Thank you, JJ. Ahmed, my next question is for you. Last fall, the Undersecretary Screws led a team from the U.S. ethanol industry on a market assessment mission to India. Was the trip successful, and why?
The trip was very successful, I would say. I think we were able to make good connects with the right set of people, including the oil marketing companies which are owned by the government, and give that message to them that you have set out a mandate, but you're not implementing that mandate. And US is there to do a hand-holding with you, take you forward. The other things that we have learned in those discussions, I think the message that was also given to the industry, that US is not against the domestic industry. We will take domestic industry, which is molasses-based ethanol producers from the sugar sector, to go along, because India does not have the infrastructure to fulfill the mandate. Just to give you an idea, the mandate is E10, but we are unable to even fulfill E5. The minister concerned acknowledged the fact that E5 would be achievable only in September of 2016. Current is only 4.35% blend average. So there is that hand-holding requirement, and US can provide that. I think that is the understanding that we have been able to give to the oil marketing companies and our domestic partners in the US, in India. I think that has been very, very, very impressive discussions that we had.
Thank you. One additional question. India has been a significant market for U.S. ethanol for its industrial chemical industry, but currently prohibits the importation of ethanol for fuel blending. The question is this barrier to trade an issue that can be resolved in light of India's long history of trade protectionism?
Okay, this is a good question. Ray, I think India has been protecting the domestic market, but I would put it like this: it is more towards the food products. India has been protecting, for the protection is being given for the wheat and the rice segment. But just for the knowledge of the group here, India has been importing food and non-food products for quite many years now. 5.5 million tons of pulses, 15.5 million tons of vegetable oil that we need, more recently corn into the market. And I think India is moving ahead. The new government is keen to take the step forward, especially on the clean air. I think that is very important. The current movement of ethanol into India is for the industrial sector. But the fuel blending, I think it is important that as the three organizations work together under a working group that has been set up to provide that information to the stakeholders in India, that what US can do. I think another factor here is the US ambassador to India, Richard Verma, made it very important, very clear information to the statement to government of India that US has been there. In the clean air was not as a problem in 1970s in eastern part of the country. We have some learnings, and we will be happy to do hand-holding and provide that information to the Indian counterparts to take it forward. It is also important, I think it's some kind of a pressure that needs to be built up from the consumer side in India, that Indian consumers need clean air. We don't have that clean air. It is not possible to take clean air from the US to India, but I think it's important to take a product that will make the air much more cleaner in the country. But trade protectionism is primarily for the food component. It is not for the non-food components here. I think that is important.
Well, thank you, Ahmed. Paul, we'll go back to you. How does the contribution of market development funding from the members of the Ethanol Export Steering Committee impact USDA's decisions concerning its commitment to promoting ethanol exports?
Good question. Obviously, as we saw in the video, Secretary Vilsack is a major supporter of the ethanol industry. He's a vocal advocate to Congress and to EPA on preserving the RFS. He led the effort to move to approve ethanol as a commodity eligible for export promotion funding. And what we like to see at USDA is active private sector participation and contributions. So the more energy that we see, the more resources we see in these export initiatives, the greater the opportunity that market development funding will remain available for this initiative. To date, the partnership has been outstanding. Private sector contributions are enormous. Mark already gave a little shout out for Jim Miller, but I'd like to second that in that Growth Energy hired the right person for the job. Tom introduced him on day one as the export guru, and Jim really understands what it is to approach foreign policy makers. He's been there, he's done that. So his involvement is definitely supported our decision to work with the industry. So as we have these additional activities, the Secretary's leading an ethanol team to Peru in March. We're having an event in Taiwan in April around the APEC, the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is a group of 21 countries along the Pacific to discuss free trade of different products. Your participation, we've had outstanding participation. Steve Lyle, Doug Bourbon, ADM has been very active. Mark has been active. So all I can say is just keep doing what you're doing. Don't change anything. Market development is a slow, long-term process, especially in this industry where government regulations need to be changed. We're not the most swiftest country in the world for passing new laws and mandates, and the same holds true in these other countries. So I saw a study the other day that says you need to see a commercial 12 times before it actually sinks in. Well, our market development is the same way. We need to go out and we've got to deliver this message over and over and over again, and then somewhere down the road we'll reap the fruits of our work.
Thank you. We are very fortunate to have Mike O'Brien on the domestic and Jim Miller on the export on our team.
Agreed.
On a different topic, JJ, I'll hit you with this, and you'll have to answer it to the best of your ability, but I know some of these questions are a little more difficult, so I apologize for that, but I think you can put an interesting perspective on it. China has recently filed anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases against the U.S. DDG producers. This follows on the heels of China's most recent import barriers concerning GMOs and a 2010 anti-dumping case. So the question is, what is required for China to become a dependable market for both DDGs and ethanol?
Thanks for the question. It's difficult. Okay, I think I would like to say, first give some comments on DDGS situation. DDGS is different from ethanol. Actually, what U.S. Green Council has been doing has been trying to promote DDGS barley and corn export to China. So the reason for the case is just because the record level of imports of U.S. DDGS make Chinese industry, they say they got hurt. So the background for this is just because there's a high record domestic corn prices. So that means end users in China is having difficulty to use cheap corn. So that's the reason why there's behind the anti-dumping case. For ethanol, it is different. So, but for ethanol futures market, we are still we will do the similar approach, like continue start with what is required for China's market is what is needed. Kind of so far there's no national mandate program for ethanol usage. So that's what I think now. As many years ago, when we talked to Chinese officials, they say U.S. side need approve. U.S. is a dependable supplier. So now it comes a time, say, U.S. corn and ethanol is competitive and trade is happening. So that means there's value for the industry and the government to work together to start working on China market to get a bigger program for ethanol mandate program. In that case, when the consumption market was there during the process, the trade will work.
Thank you, J.J. Joel, as a producer, from the producer's standpoint, would you have any reflections that you'd like to add to that?
Well, I'd just say the U.S. ethanol producer has shown to countries that are getting to take in ethanol. Lots of people want different specs of ethanol, and guys like Marquis and a bunch of plants out there have adapted, what kind of specs we can make at the plant level to meet their demand. And, it's a testament to us as an industry is we have goals like exports, and our industry will do what it can to help meet those goals, if it's a spec or whatever else it is.
Thank you, Joel. Mark?
I'll add to that. I think I'll state the obvious, that exports rise the tide for all ships. And so maybe you're not the closest plant to the export market, or maybe you don't make the spec that goes to the export market, but we all know ethanol is fungible. And if we can grow the export market, it not only helps the people doing the direct exporting, but helps the whole industry, because it moves product out and it raises the value. So I think we all need to get behind the effort. One other thing I'd like to mention, while we still have a couple minutes, is if you get a little time here, walk by these signs, look at the people who are supporting this industry. Thank them. Also, if you know of people that should be supporting the industry, people who are vendors to our industry, point them out to your board members, put pressure on them yourself. It's going to take a lot of funds to do this right. We just committed about $500,000 to this foreign markets project. There's going to be more need as time goes forward. If we're going to hit 2 billion gallons by 22 or 4 billion gallons by 24, it's going to take resources. And so thank people, encourage people, whether they're plants that aren't carrying load. There's about 200 dry mill ethanol plants in the U.S. About 90 of them are in our group. That means there's about 110 that aren't. And so encourage people to join, pay their dues. Thank people who do join and pay their dues. But I think that the vendors and the industries around us that benefit from our industry, I think we can do more with joining hands with the corn growers. A lot of you are corn growers. Encourage corn growers to support what we're doing, both domestically and internationally. And I think we all win together if we all pull together. One thing I've been really amazed by this industry, we can have another ethanol plant 40 miles down the road, which in most industries would be considered a competitor. We consider them a comrade. And, I think Ray and some of us that share parts and share ideas and share rides to events, and it's just a testament to how great of an industry, grassroots, mid-American industry, and I couldn't be more proud to be part of it. But we need to remember and stay focused and renew our focus. And a lot of that's going to be around fundraising and having the financial funds to make these initiatives really go.
Thank you, Mark. That brings to mind another question. When you're pointing out the need for more money, and we know the production of domestic ethanol, 14-some billion, I would like to ask the question from Mark and Joel. This money that you're talking about put on a per gallon basis versus what we might be expected to add to our product. In other words, what per gallon does it add versus what per gallon? I think that'd be a dramatic. Now, you probably don't have these figures, but you can come close to a pretty good guess. Joel, let's start with you.
Well, it is a very tough question. The different export grades can go for different premiums versus regular domestic fuel at different times of the year and different market conditions. But I don't know. I would say, generally speaking, 2 to 7 cents a gallon, maybe 5 cents a gallon. It's just from the gut average, I would say.
And Joel or Mark, and I'll give you a chance to answer this as well, Mark, but these funds that you're talking about, the need to address the question within the industry as a whole, what are we talking in comparing to that 2 to 5 cents that we would drive back to all plants, raising the tide of everyone? What would it cost if everybody contributed equally on the total gallons we produce?
Yeah, without doing the math quite as quickly as Ray wants us to, I'll say that, you know, people making a 1/4 cent a gallon commitment or a 1/2 cent a gallon or a penny commitment, those are important commitments. And when you got half the industry that's maybe not making that large of a commitment, it needs to be made. That's the kind of encouragement is we need to get all, it won't be that big of a sacrifice if we can get everybody to be making it. Same way on the per bushel basis for corn growers, the checkoffs and whatnot. You know, you take a product that's $3.60 a bushel, and a lot of the checkoffs are you know, a 1/2 cent or less. We probably need to look at what other industries do. We need to look at who our competitor is, Big Oil and their deep pockets. We've probably got to commit more funds. It's a hard time right now in a lull in the market, but we all know this market's about cycles, and next summer it'll be different than it is now. And we just need to all be on board on doing our part and getting the ones who aren't doing their part to do their part. And I think it shouldn't be that big of a burden on everyone. And I think the return on investment is huge. And we're believers in it. We do it. I mean, I know a lot of you do. All of you do. But there are people that don't. We need to get them on board, whether they're a vendor or they're a plant that's not participating.
Thank you, Joel and Mark. I think at this time we'll open up for questions. I know that we stand between your break, but somebody surely got a pressing question or two they'd like asked. So over here.
Okay, now it is working. Hi, good morning. My name is Stefan Wittig. I'm from a company called Grupo Baltico in Mexico. First of all, I want to really thank you all for being so willing to share your story, because as you know, Mexican ethanol market is just developing. I shared a panel with Amit last week, and one of the things we discussed is exactly that. In Mexico, there are 2 ways for getting ethanol, or the demand for ethanol increased. One way is through Pemex, the Mexican state oil company, and we already are starting at a pilot test for 5% of the market, so we are starting an E6 plant that would lead us to 640 million gallons a year for ethanol when we reach the whole demand for gasoline with an E6 plant. And second, we started up some E100 stations, and we really like sharing with you the story, because it was Japanese cars how we started with. And today, these Japanese cars are more than 100,000 miles each one, and they have been running very well without any modification, without any problem in any of their components. So I think it's something that can be done and will be done at some point in time when we share a little bit more, and the oil industry also sees us as more allies than competitors. And exactly talking about that, and what I wanted to share more than ask a question, is that yesterday exciting news was announced by the President of Mexico in Houston. And this news is that starting April 1st, the imports for and distribution for gasoline are open in Mexico for any private company. But the only ones in Mexico that have the infrastructure for starting to doing something are the ethanol producers. Because all the infrastructure for transporting gasoline is only it belongs to state oil company, so it's not going to happen anything there. And we, as ethanol producers, with the tanks, with logistics terminals we have been developing in the last years, we're the only ones that are going to be taking a little bit of advantage of that if we get the right investments. But I wanted to share that story with you, that it's possible that you have shared big stories with us, and we really look up to the American ethanol industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think the 3 organizations, RFA Growth and the Grains Council, recognizes the importance of our neighbors to the south and certainly appreciate the opportunity that is presenting itself there. So thank you for that additional information. Another question. Remember, if you scratch your head, I'm going to call on you, so I'm kind of like Conrad on the bidding. All right. I think that's it. I want to thank everyone for participating in the panel. I particularly want to thank all of you for your passion for the industry, for your work ethic that you're doing for the industry, and the focus that you're giving the industry, and for your time. So thank you very much. Let's give them a good hand.
So I signed my name on number 24. Hey! Can I just say, boy, just one more?
Thank you. Thank you. Another big thanks to Ray and the panelists. I see some of you getting up. Before you go out the door, we are going to break here shortly, but I'm going to announce the winners from all the golf activities yesterday. I know you guys take your game seriously and you want bragging rights. So I'll run through all the names quickly so I don't cut too much into your break. There was a tie for first place. Both teams had 10 under par as their score, so I guess they flipped a coin to figure out who's going to have bragging rights as first place. The first place team was Chad Greenway, Greg Brugelman, Steve Seabrook, Mark Hastings. The second place team, who also had a same score of 10 under par, was made up of Nick Hatcher, Andy Bullock, Fred Rayner, and Donna Funk. And our third place team was Nathan Vandergrind, Luke Rockhold, Bryce Jones, and Rich Peterson. So congrats. Now, the contest holes and raffle winners. My apologies if I butcher any names. I'll do my best not to. Contest holes. You guys can claim your prize at the hospitality desk outside. For longest drive on the 18th hole, Steve Seabrook, going home with a Odyssey Pro putter. Longest putt on the 9th hole, Tim Holtquist, going home with a tailor-made 5-wood. Closest to the pin on hole 12, Fred Rayner, going home with a ping putter. So congrats to you guys. Now our raffle winners. You guys can also claim your prizes at the hospitality desk out front. Going home with American Ethanol vintage hats, Jason Bassett, Dave Hudak, Tom Cordium, Mike, I don't know if this is French, Lozier or Lozer, my apologies, Kevin Monroe, Jack Rogers, Holly Schwark, and Steve Seabrook, all going home with that vintage hat. Going home with black American Ethanol hats, Isaac Crawford, Rob Davis, Donna Funk, Pat Tenner, John Laterio, Andy Miller, Wade Roby, and Jeff Sands. Salinas umbrellas, Tom Holtquist and Kermit Knott. Pick those up at the hospitality desk. Salinas jacket, Andrew Johansson. American Ethanol shirts, Edward Benatti, Andrew Ledley, Greg Olson, McCord Pankinen, Nathan Vandergrind. Black polos, Nick Hatcher and Jim Lighting. Poet vest, Steve Ladley. Salinas Fitbit, it's a fun one, Ryan Thorpe. And finally, Salinas golf bag, Jeff Zuger. Again, I apologize if I butchered any of those names. You can again pick up your swag at the hospitality desk out in the hallway. We will break now for some refreshments and coffee sponsored by CTE. So thank you to them for that. And we have some swag from our sponsors. If you guys haven't picked it up, it's in the back corner of the room, so be sure to do so. And then we'll come back here for our last panel at 10:45.